but I better move on a bit quicker. I'm going a bit slow here. When God spoke to Abraham in Genesis 12, he made 4 promises to Abraham. Some call it 3, but I think it's more helpful to think of 4. It's part of a package, so they're not isolated, they're interconnected. So a promise package with 4 key things. My view is that these 4 promises are like the 4 lanes of a major highway that run from a city to city. Now, I'm not very good on the Indian highways, so I've not traveled on that many. But, a big highway will have, perhaps 4 lanes, probably more, but let's call it 4. These 4 lanes run through from Abraham to Malachi and into the New Testament, like the major highway through the Old Testament. And my view would be that virtually anywhere in the Old Testament, I'll qualify this in a minute, wherever you are, whatever text you're in, one or more of those 4 themes will be dominant in the text. The 4 themes, of course, what does God promise Abraham? He promises him numerous descendants. In Genesis 12, that's part of being a great nation, but it's separated and highlighted several times in later chapters, in chapter 15 and 22 and so on. Descendants like the sand on the seashore, stars in the sky in Genesis 15, that sort of idea. Lots of children. So people. Secondly, land. So people and land together is the great nation. But again, later in chapter 12 itself, verse 7, this land I will give you, because Abraham by then has traveled to the promised land. And later on, of course, Genesis 15, it talks about the boundaries of the land, even as far as the Euphrates River. And so people, land. Thirdly, blessing. You will be blessed, your name will be great. That centerpiece of Genesis 12, verse 2 and 3. Blessing, the word, root word occurs 5 times in those 2 verses. And so blessing, that is Abraham's own greatness, if you like, favor under God. But the 4th part, the end of verse 3, all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. Now there, I think, is mission beginning. The promises to Abraham are not about Abraham himself. They're not just about his greatness. You will be a blessing. You'll be blessed so that, in effect, you'll be a blessing to others. You'll be blessed so that through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So what's going on here in these 4 promises is that Abraham and Sarah, just 2 people, old people, of course, are going to become the head of a new people group, which becomes the nation Israel, but not for their own sake. It's not that God chooses the Jews for the sake of the Jews. They're not even called Jews yet, but the Israelites are not even called that. They're just the family of Abraham. He doesn't call them to bless them so that their life is comfortable. He calls them to bless them in order to bless the rest of the world, basically. And they're the 4 key promises. We're going to see a little bit more added to that when we get to David later. But those 4 promises, at least up to David, become a 4-lane highway. If you trace the story of Genesis, it is all about, number 1, descendants. No descendants. How are we going to get a descendant? I don't trust the promise of a descendant. I'll have relations with Hagar, wrong descendant. I'm going to have a child through Sarah eventually. Yes, it's come. Oh, now you want me to sacrifice my son, my only son, Isaac? What's going to happen to the promise of descendants? So all the way through Genesis, the theme predominantly is on that promise, the first one, descendants. By the time you get to Exodus 1 and 2, several generations after Joseph, there are numerous descendants. The Israelites are multiplying like crazy in Egypt. That's why Pharaoh gets so anxious. Now the theme begins to shift to land because they're outside the promised land. And up to the story of Joshua, land becomes the sort of main promise. But once they're in the land, well, part of it stays land because they don't always hold it. They keep losing land in the book of Judges. But part of it is, well, are you actually going to be blessed? We don't see much in the story that shows blessing to the rest of the world, to the other nations. We'll touch on a little bit of that in a minute. But that I hope is helping you see where I would say mission begins. It begins with Abraham, that all the nations of the earth will be blessed. The foundation of that is that God's made all the nations and the peoples of the earth anyway. Genesis 10 lists the nations, Genesis 1 lists everything. So it's not like God trying to conquer something that's not his. Mission is about bringing back to God what is rightfully his. And that begins with Abraham, which is God's response to the problem of sin and the fall and its consequences. And as I say, those 4 promises from Abraham travel through the Old Testament. They'll be added to with David, which we'll get to in a couple of points' time. I want to move on then to Exodus just briefly. Israel in Exodus, in Egypt, in slavery, crying out to God. And at the end of Exodus 2, God remembers the covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So because of the promise to Abraham, he's going to rescue them and bring them into the promised land. And the confrontation with Pharaoh is about, let my people go to worship me, and so on. They're in relationship with God. The name of God is given to Moses at the burning bush, and so on. Why does God redeem them? Because of the promises to Abraham. The promises to Abraham drive the story of the Old Testament all the way through. But on the way out of Egypt, they stop at Mount Sinai. And there God gives them the law, 10 commandments and that range of other laws, the laws to build a tabernacle, and so on and so forth. There's some crucial things here in general. God does not give law to Abraham, basically. Law comes after rescue. That is, law is a response, if you like, to grace. So the 10 commandments, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt, out of slavery. Then you shall have no other gods before me. That is, law responds to what God has done. Grace predominates. Now, that's pretty critical, I think, for understanding mission. Mission is not just about making people law keepers. Mission is going to be about bringing God's grace, which will draw out a response of law keeping from those who embrace and are embraced by the grace of God. But what about all this law? What is the point of giving Israel all these laws? Well, one is it's good and caring for other people. It's a way of protecting the poor and the needy and the widows and the orphans and so on. But there's a big evangelistic thrust about this as well. For example, in Deuteronomy 4, verses 5 to 8, the people of Israel, or God says to them, or Moses, God through Moses says to them something about the purpose of law. He says this, just as the Lord my God has charged me, I now charge you to keep statutes and ordinances in the land that you're about to enter and occupy. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, that is nations, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people, for what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? Now, certainly keeping the law that God gives is for the Israelites' own benefit. If you keep the law, you'll be blessed by God, long life in the land, protected by God, and so on. But that's not the end of the story. The law is also given for, let's call it, missional or evangelistic purposes. So let me just try and sharpen this idea a bit. The model in the Old Testament is that the people of God will be a nation in a particular place. We call it the Promised Land, or Israel, Palestine today. It's the land surrounded by the Dead Red Seas. And that people was to live under God's law so that God will bless them, promise to Abraham, number 3. And as they're being blessed, if you like, the people will, other nations, as Deuteronomy 4 says, say, wow, look at them. What a great people they are. What a righteous people they are. What a great God they've got. Now that if you like, is the sort of, key point about how Old Testament mission functions. It's not the only thing, but it's probably the predominant thing. It's an attractive model of mission, or as some would call it, I've got to get these terms right. I always have to think carefully about them. A centripetal motion, that is towards the center. There are two sort of thrusts in engineering or scientific terms. Centripetal, I think I've got this the right way around, sort of like a magnet, attracting, drawing you to the center. Centrifugal pushes you outwards. You know, if you're in a vehicle, a car or a bus, and you go around a corner very fast, you feel like you're being thrown out of the center, outwards. That's centrifugal motion, the going out motion. The predominant motion in the Old Testament is centripetal, to draw in, to attract in, like a light will attract a moth or an insect coming in. So what God is trying to do in the Old Testament, if you like, the model, is that Israel will be in the promised land, living under the law, thus being blessed by God, so that the nations will say, wow, this people, they're great. Their God is great. Their law is righteous. We like this. We want to be part of this. We're attracted into it. Now, mostly Israel didn't get this in the Old Testament story. They just thought, oh, it's all about us. We don't care about the nations. We don't like them. But actually, they missed the point, that it's not just for their benefit, that it's actually for the benefit of the world. That is, if Israel is an attractive model, it will draw people in. So that's my point about law and mission, if you like. What's that? Section 4, the second point. And but we only see a couple of examples. Now, if we're in a class, I'd pause here and ask for you to think of some examples, but it's a bit harder on Zoom to do this easily. But can you think of foreigners being attracted to Israel because of their obedience to the law in the Old Testament? Not easy to think. You know, a couple of examples. Maybe Ruth. Maybe. I mean, she's drawn back with Naomi to care for Naomi. But it's not particularly because Israel is obedient. It's the period of the Judges, after all. Maybe Naaman the Syrian. But that's a bit more because of what he's heard about God doing things. Rahab the harlot. Again, it's what she's heard about God. Queen of Sheba. Sort of. One way of thinking about this is that it's a bit like, well, if you like, the cricket ground behind me in my picture. On the cricket ground is Israel, the nations, and God. And, well, maybe not the nations, but representatives, if you like. And in the stands are the world's nations, the peoples of the world. And so what do they see? They see God at work. God powerfully defeating Pharaoh, providing in the wilderness, defeating enemies. And they think, wow, I like that God. So we see a bit of that. I think Naaman the Syrian's in that category. But what about Israel on the ground? The nations are watching Israel. Much harder to see examples in the Old Testament where they look on and say, wow, what a great Israel it is. Deuteronomy 4 says that's the goal of the law, to be blessed by God so that other nations look on in wonder. But it's much harder to find the examples of where that actually happens. And that's because Israel kept failing. They're given the law, but they fail to keep it. So we've got to distinguish between the intention of God in the Old Testament and the reality of what kept failing, basically. Israel failed, and therefore they weren't blessed, and therefore the nations weren't blessed, by and large. Ruth, Rahab, rare examples. Naaman the Syrian, Queen of Sheba, attracted by Solomon's greatness and wealth and the extent of his kingdom. But is she attracted by righteousness? Maybe wisdom, but less obviously righteousness, I suppose. So what's meant to happen is that the nations would come to God through a blessed and obedient Israel, but largely it failed. But that's the model that runs all the way to Malachi. So whether it's the narratives of the Old Testament, Joshua to Kings and Chronicles as well, and a bit of other narrative beyond that, like Esther, beyond that meaning beyond the exile, or whether it's the prophets speaking into that situation, The structure is the same. What they envisage is the same. That is, what should be happening is an obedient Israel in the land, therefore being blessed by God and therefore being attractive to the nations. But they're failing all the time through the Old Testament. So distinguish between the ideal and the real, if you like, through the Old Testament. Now, that leads us on to the next if you like, a next step. It's still within the third section, still within the main bulk of the Old Testament story, number 3, I've called it. But I think it is important to just pause at this point. When David became king and king in Jerusalem, he desired to build God a temple, as we know. 2 Samuel 7. God wanted to build a house. God said, no, your son will build me a house, but I'll give you a house. There's a play on words in the text, as many of you may know. David wanted to build a house as in a temple, but God said, I'll give you a house as in a dynasty. And so David's son would build the house of the temple. But God promised David 2 things there. He promised him a temple, well, to be built by his son, and he promised him a kingdom, a dynasty, if you like, king. Those temple king become, if you like, the 5th and 6th lanes of the highway, because they're promises of God that will extend beyond David's time, so that they go with, they complement, they fit in with people in general, land, blessing, nations being blessed, but now added into that will be the king of the people and the temple in the focus where God will dwell. And I would argue that from 2 Samuel 7 onwards, any text now will have at least one of those 6 lanes as its key theme. Solomon builds the temple, as we know. The Queen of Sheba comes, and in many ways I think that's the high point of the story of the Old Testament. Solomon, we're told, is the king over the land even as far as the territories to the Euphrates. He's not actually the king of those territories, but he exercises a sort of influence over them, if you like. And that echoes Genesis 15, the promise of land to Abraham when he was doubting. Solomon's extent of kingship is now matching what God had promised to Abraham's land. For the first time, as far as we know, the first time ever, the descendants of Abraham occupy such territory, and they never do again, really, after Solomon. The temple is built, as promised to David, his father, and Solomon dedicates it in 1 Kings 8. And again, there's echoes there of of Abrahamic promises, and the Davidic ones, of course, very strongly. But the idea that even the nations could come. So if a foreigner in 1 Kings 8 would pray towards this temple, God would hear them. That's a remarkable thing for Solomon to pray. But it fits the pattern of you will be blessed to be a blessing to the nations. The nations will be drawn to the land, to the temple. I think what perhaps is also happening, I've not particularly pursued this thought exactly, but in general terms, Israel had a tabernacle. They didn't, God didn't need a temple particularly. And God wanted them to be attracted to him through the people. But in a way, as Solomon builds the temple and prays, the temple becomes the attraction point, maybe a bit more than the people, the nation. Maybe it reflects a bit the failure of the nation. And so God himself, in a way more permanently, in a temple, might become more of an attraction to bring people to himself through his nation. So the temple and the king fit in with the promises to Abraham, and the ultimate goal still remains the blessing of the nations, basically. Where we see that theme taken up a lot later is in the prophets. Whether they're the 8th century or post-exilic prophets, wherever the prophets speak, if you like, about punishment, that comes out of the covenant curses of Deuteronomy 28 or Leviticus 26. Sickness, illness, plague, blight, mildew, no rain, famine, enemy attacks, losing land, ultimately exile. It's all there in Deuteronomy 28, Leviticus 26, the curses of the covenant. The prophets are just applying it to their day and age. But what do the prophets promise? That is, if Israel repents or if Israel turns back to God, that sort of idea, what are their promises in the prophets in general? Well, significantly, they often promise a king. Ezekiel 34, a king like David will come. Or Jeremiah 23 and other passages like that. There are lots of royal themes of the king who will come, David, the righteous branch like David, who will come. So that promise to David becomes projected into the future. There are promises of land. So in Amos 9, the restoration of Israel and Judah, same in Ezekiel 37, the land being reunited, if you like, all the tribes together. That's a land promise to Abraham. There are certainly promises of blessing. You'll be blessed, that sort of idea, in different promises of the prophets. That's going back to Abraham. Children, descendants, multiplication again, the first promise to Abraham. But there's also promises about, the temple. So Zion, Jerusalem, temple, themes, rebuilding the temple in Haggai, Zechariah. God himself will bring people back to Zion, back to Jerusalem. You see those themes in various places of the prophets. The temple, the great temple vision at the end of Ezekiel, for example. And the promises of the prophets are simply the reiteration, if you like, of the promises to Abraham and David. People, land, blessing, king, temple. But the one I haven't touched on yet is, if you like, the blessing to the nations. And it's there in the prophets. The nations will come in at the end, in several places at the end of Isaiah and Zechariah in particular, but not just there. There are hints in other places that the whole world will come to worship God. So the eschatological role of Jerusalem as being the focus, the land, but Jerusalem within the land, being the focus of drawing the nations back to God in the, if you like, the eschatological pictures of the prophets, their projection into the future beyond the exile or return from exile, not just to come back to the land, but God will bring the nations to himself. There it is, the same model, if you like, that was made to Abraham, running all the way to Malachi through the prophets. Now, the model so far is an attraction model, a centripetal model, bringing people into the land, to Jerusalem, to God. But I've got my sixth point is a question. Did Israel have a missionary calling? Now, how did you define these terms? But what is meant by here is more the going out. So we know the Great Commission, go to the end of the world. I remember many years ago now, my then pastor, I was already ordained, but the senior pastor of the church decided to preach a series of sermons on mission. And the first one was the command by God to Abraham, go to the land I'll show you. And I thought, well, that's not really mission. I don't think the word go always means mission. But of course it does in the Great Commission. But the question's often asked, is there a going out in the Old Testament? Is there a centrifugal motion in the Old Testament? We've talked, the main model, I'm convinced, is centripetal, drawing in, attracting in. But what about the going out? Is that there in the Old Testament? My view would be that when Jesus says go, or going, make disciples, in Matthew 28, there is a shift in emphasis for mission. It's not a total change, but the going becomes much more significant from the ascension of Jesus onwards. And we see that in the narrative of the Acts of the Apostles, of course. But some would say there's hints of it in the Old Testament. For example, in the book of Jonah. Some read Jonah as the sort of paradigm of mission for the Old Testament. Jonah is sent to Nineveh to proclaim the gospel. Some would say, well, it's not really quite the gospel. It's just simply a message of repentance, but Nineveh does repent. It's also really a story, though. I think it does have something to do with mission. I don't think it's simply a model that everyone's got to go, like Jesus commands. But the key question at the end of Jonah, it's interesting how the book ends with a question, is, am I not right to have a concern for the other nations, basically? So what Jonah is doing is not so much saying go in mission as saying, isn't it right that God's concern is also for the nations? A little bit more foundational, if you like, for the idea of mission. So I would say in the Old Testament, Jonah is more teaching not so much the going side, but as the concern of God for the nations, that God is not only concerned for his own people. We find that elsewhere. He uses the Chaldeans or the Babylonians to in Habakkuk and elsewhere, and people object to that. And at other times, he shows almost a care and concern for the Egyptians or other nations. A similar idea, but it's a bit more pointed in Jonah. What I think it's addressing is the fact that Israel thinks God's only concerned with Israel. He's only loving Israel, and he doesn't want or like the other nations. Whereas I think Jonah is wanting to open Israelite eyes to see that God does have a concern for the other nations. It's not so much about the going in general, so much as provoking them to see that God's concern for the other nations is fair and right. And it's a rebuke. Jonah is, if you like, a model of Israel, and he runs away from a concern for the other nations. And in great humor, I think, and irony, the sailors are more pious than Jonah when they pray. And here we see pagan sailors actually expressing more faith than Jonah. So that is opening Israel's eyes to say, oh, this God's actually concerned, has a bigger concern than just us. It's not just an Israel concern. Another way in which people answer this question, does Israel have a missionary calling? Think of the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 40 onwards. The servant of the Lord, for example, your task is too small to just be a servant to Israel. It's for the nations, a light to the nations. And again, I think Israel's the servant in Isaiah, those servant passages of Isaiah 40 to 53, typically people call it 4 servant songs in 42, 49, 50, and 52:3. The identity of them as songs only comes from the 1890s from a German theologian, Doom. But the servant is identified in different ways through those chapters. And the servant is, if you like, meant to do what Israel failed to do. You may know that in one of the servant songs, he's called Israel. And people have think, well, if the servant's called Israel, who are the people? I mean, what's going on here? But I think what's going on is that the servant is meant to be, to do or be what Israel has failed to do or be. And it's interesting in those chapters, say Isaiah 40 onwards, beyond 53, the word servant is only singular in chapters 40 to 53, but after that becomes a plural, as if the servant enables Israel to become servants. So this servant is, if you like, a model of, a bit like Jonah and that story. Jonah represents bad Israel. The servant represents what Israel is meant to be. A light to the nations, though, isn't necessarily going. A light attracts. So it's not necessarily saying you will go to the nations, but rather attract them. But you'll act for them. The nations matter to God, is what's being said with the servant, I think, in those chapters of Isaiah. More briefly, in point 7, I've put here Psalms, Paul, and Old Testament mission. I've gone over time, really, but let me try and say this briefly. The Psalms is another place where in the Old Testament you find a sense of going or looking to the nations. So in several Psalms, you get the idea of, sing to the Lord, all the earth. It's as if Israel, if you can imagine Israel maybe around the temple, but in the land, singing out to the other nations. Bit hard to imagine that, but you imagine going up to the border with, Nepal or China or Bangladesh or somewhere in India and standing at the border and then singing over the border, sing to the Lord, as though almost like you're going, but you're not quite going. It's sort of like shouting out to the nations, but staying within your own nation in a way. The Psalms do that a bit in different ways. Psalm 67, for example, let all the peoples praise you, O God. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy. Now, the Psalms at least are teaching Israel that God wants the nations to embrace him, It's not necessarily going, but it is actually reaching out to the nations. So what we're seeing is God wants the nations. That's the promise to Abraham. It's foundational. It's based on the foundation that God made. There's rebukes of that. There's a rebuke in Jonah. There's a rebuke in the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 40 onwards. And there's the teaching of the right attitude to the nations, proclaiming the gospel, good news, or whatever, have a new song to the nations in the Psalms. And my point, I don't want to elaborate on this point here because I have gone on too long, but if you trace the idea of Paul's mission, not so much the journey, so much as where he speaks about the gospel to the nations, it's interesting how often he quotes Psalms in doing that. And so there is a strong, and the Old Testament in general, I don't just mean the Psalms. When we get, let me come to the final point, putting it together. I commented how from Abraham onwards, there are 4 and then later 6, when you get to David, 2 extra, key threads, lanes of the highway. But where do they come to in the New Testament? I want us to help us see that they don't stop. It's not like a dead end and the New Testament starts another route. So when you get to the New Testament, who are the descendants of Abraham? Because that's the first promise to Abraham. It's not Jewish people. It's people who believe in Jesus. Jesus made that clear himself when he rebuked the Pharisees and Jewish leaders. You don't believe in me? You're children of the devil. You're not children of Abraham. Children of Abraham, for example, in Galatians and Romans, are those who believe in Jesus, whether Jew or Gentile. You and I, brothers and sisters, are children of Abraham fully through faith. So that's where that laneway goes. The second one is the land. Where does that theme go? Isn't it striking how little land is mentioned in the New Testament as a theme, where it's so important in the Old? It's interesting that when you're a Christian in the New Testament, there is never, ever any hint or encouragement even that you must make a pilgrimage to the land. So when Paul wrote to the Philippians or the Thessalonians or the Galatians or the Corinthians, or when he preached to anyone else, did he encourage them to go to Jerusalem, have a look, be a pilgrim? Never, actually. But where does the land theme go? Land in the Old Testament is often called an inheritance, and in the New Testament, inheritance is about the whole earth. There's a place in Paul's writing where he changes an Old Testament reference to land to the earth. Jesus' Beatitudes speak about you'll inherit the earth, the whole world. So the land of the Old Testament where Israel would live finds, if you like, its fulfillment in the whole earth being filled with the people of God. Blessing. Well, in the Old Testament, we see the blessing to Abraham as a theme. We see blessings of long life, security, safety, good health, rain, crops, animals, etc. In the New Testament, the blessings become eschatological, blessed with every spiritual blessing. In Ephesians 1, the Beatitudes of Matthew 5 are eschatological in the end, because the blessings of the Old Testament fit the model of an earthly land, and the blessings of the New Testament fit the model of a kingdom of heaven. The nations, much more clearly in the New Testament, is a theme. Now it's going as well as being an attraction. So one thing I meant to say about Paul, but I forgot, is that there's still the attraction thing. The church now, not the nation, but the church is to be attractive to the pagans, if you like, who live around. See how they love us, be attracted to God through the love of Christians, the care for Christian poor, and so on. The king promise finds fulfillment in Jesus. The temple promise finds fulfillment not in a church building, but in Jesus, the living temple. All those 6 themes to Abraham and David have a trajectory into the New Testament. They keep fitting together. And mission continues as one of those dominant themes right from Abraham through to the end of Scripture. Now, I better finish there. My hope is to give us a biblical perspective, a panoramic view, if you like. The mission is not just something tacked on when Jesus rises from the dead before he ascends, but rather is fundamental from Abraham onwards, from sin onwards, really, to bring about the new creation where there are people of every tribe and tongue and language around the throne of heaven. Well, let me stop there. Thank you very much, Mr. Theophilus, and I'll hand back to you for now.